Hello, today we're speaking with Katherine co-founder and CEO of Strela Biotechnology. Welcome to the podcast, Katherine.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Great. To start, could you tell us a little bit about Strela Biotechnology?
Sure. So the premise of Strela is that we can predict the ripeness of fruits, and we use this information to optimize the food supply chain. So right now, a lot of processes within the food supply chain aren't based off of any information about the biological functions of a fruit, how it's moving, or what its shelf life really is. They're very static, and they're based on kind of standard commodities. And what we do is we add an extra level of technology to allow players within the supply chain to make better decisions about what to do with perishable products.
And what does that technology look like?
So right now it looks like a sensor in terms of hardware that measures the emittance of gases that fruits emit. So fruits emit gases as they begin to ripen. You've probably seen this if you put an unripe banana next to a ripe one, and you see that it ripens a lot faster than if it was by itself. And so what we do is we measure these gas communications between fruits, and we can determine how mature the fruit itself is. This information is also kind of broadcasted to our users via user interface that allows them to see what fruit they have in their inventory that is most mature at a certain time.
Understood. And then on the basis of that, they can assess, which fruit to push out through their supply chain at which point, in terms of it just gives more information and allows better decision making?
Yeah, exactly. So our primary customer right now is a packer. So a packer for apples and pears stores fruit for a very long period of time. So for example, an apple in a grocery store can be over a year old. And a typical packer has hundreds of storage rooms that are filled with millions of pieces of fruit. And they don't have that much information about where their ripest fruit is located. And so what we do is we monitor these huge rooms filled with apples and pears, and we tell the packer where the ripest fruit is so that they can send always the most mature fruit down the supply chain to the customer.
And so the sensor is basically sitting in a box or a pallet of fruit and kind of assesses from there. So do you need like a sensor per, box or per pallet, or how does that exactly work?
Yeah, so it all depends on the use case of the customer. So for packers, they make a lot of their decisions based on a whole room level. So a room contains about 2,000 bins of fruit, which each have about 1,000 pounds inside of them. So 5 million pieces of fruit at a time are the decisions that packers make. However, retailers make their decisions usually on a pallet-sized resolution. So depending on the customer, our sensor measures different volumes of fruit.
Amazing. And what drove the initial decision to start Strela?
Honestly, I was still in university and I was beginning to think about a grad school program. And my background is primarily in neuroscience. And I wasn't really sure that I wanted to commit to an 8-year PhD program.
Sure.
And so started reading things that were unrelated to, neuroscience, which is my field of study. And I read somewhere that 40% of food is wasted before it's consumed. And that was just such an interesting and appalling number to me. It was very compelling. And so I started digging into it.
And what did that kind of research process, that digging in, look like?
The first step was to walk to my nearest grocery store and ask the manager there if they had a lot of spoilage on the store level. She was a little surprised by the question,
Sure.
but said that the majority of the loss occurs a little bit more upstream and suggested that I talk to someone more on the distribution side. And so I took a train instead of going to class a couple times a week and started talking to these packers.
And what was the reception of those packers? I suppose, basically university students showing up, asking them questions. Were they receptive to that, or did you get by some blockers?
I was very lucky. My first interactions were very kind and friendly, and I guess I lucked upon some early adopters and innovators in the market. So it was really eye-opening experience. I personally didn't even know where my apples came from before I started looking into it. That doesn't happen all the time in industry, but I think if you can bring a solution that helps the customer and ultimately is tied to their bottom line, they're quite receptive to it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, when I've been involved in other kind of early stage startups, people love to tell you about their problems. And so if you go in with the right kind of, big smile and openness, even, I suppose food packers are very kind of happy to tell you all about the pain that they go through every day with all these kind of, decomposing apples and oranges and so on.
Absolutely. And they have very difficult jobs and they do fantastically at them. So it's always great to hear about an industry that is pretty hidden, I would say.
Absolutely. And so you had this kind of idea and you kind of found this problem. What was the kind of MVP and what did that whole process look like?
Yeah, so I started experimenting in labs around the university to try to understand whether or not I could build some sort of technology that could address the problems that the Packers were speaking about. And when I came up with something that seemed to work in lab, I decided might as well just throw it in the field as quickly as possible so that I can iterate on what's necessary. Went ahead and did that. This was, I think, 2019. And that first year, we caught a mistake. A packer was supposed to open a certain room in July. And actually, in January, their apples started to go bad. We ended up saving them over $600,000 that year. And so I think that initial trial really opened our eyes up to the potential that this tech could have.
Yeah, that's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, you need every advantage that you can get as an early stage startup, and having a case study where you save a client, over $500,000 is obviously fantastic. But I suppose, the question that comes to me when I think about, like, if you're solving that level of a problem, like, what solutions were already in place to even try to detect some of these issues?
Agriculture is a really difficult industry because there's so many inputs. You're essentially relying on the earth and all of the variables that impact it. Your business relies on that, right? So generally speaking, people in agriculture use a lot of historical data, and honestly, just spending time in their industry and understanding what a good orchard looks like, what a good fruit looks like, which farmers are producing the best crop, how to deal with that crop in the most efficient manner possible. So I would say right now, agriculture is honestly more of an art than it is a science. That's why it's so difficult. It just takes decades to understand how to be a good packer or distributor or grower.
And I suppose if your historical data always, contains, we're going to lose 20 or 40% of our crop to wastage every year, and that's just your trend line, you might have it ingrained that maybe you can't improve it that much as well, right? And sometimes it takes those fresh eyes to come in and say, well, can we get this down, to 2%, right? And what would that take?
Yeah, exactly. Loss is often built into the business models of any agricultural industry. So that's definitely a challenge that needs to be addressed.
And so it sounds like you started building a sensor. Did you look at any other potential ways you could solve this, or was this physical sensor, deployed at scale the first and best idea?
No, the initial idea was to put a sticker on each individual piece of fruit that would give the customer an indication of how ripe it was. I know sometimes I've seen avocados that have stickers that say it's ripe, but how do I know? That sticker was placed, maybe a week ago, and maybe the fruit isn't ripe anymore. So I was thinking of some sort of indicator that might tell the customer kind of in real time how the fruit is doing. But honestly, the cogs associated with deploying a sticker are very challenging for a startup, especially when there's a novel technological component required.
Interesting. And so, what was your kind of background in terms of like building hardware? I mean, you're at university, you're looking at neuroscience. Did you kind of bring in other, advisors and an early team, or was it mostly kind of you sitting and figuring it out in the lab?
Yeah, so the kind of innovative part of it is more molecular biology and a little bit of electrochemistry. So that is partially my background, although I had to learn a lot and I'm still learning a lot every single day.
Sure.
And then the IoT and hardware side of things, I just asked around the university if anyone could help me build an IoT network for these types of sensors. And that's actually when I met Ziyang, who to this day is our electrical engineer who does so much of the magic behind our IoT and communication and hardware.
Amazing. And I suppose what stage and what scale are you today? Do you have kind of sensors deployed at users? Do you have paying clients? And where are you exactly?
Yeah, so 2020 was our second year of sales, and we're working with approximately half of the entire market that supplies apples and pears in the United States. It's actually a very conglomerated market. there's only about 40 customers in the United States that supply the majority of the apples and pears that we consume. And so we're working with about half of them right now.
Amazing. And what did the kind of sales cycle or go to market for those 40 customers or 20 or 40 customers look like? Was this getting on phones? Was it mass marketing? Something else?
Definitely not mass marketing, and even phone calls don't work very well. Agriculture is a very face-to-face industry, so there's a lot of personal meetings and interactions, which obviously was made much more difficult with the situation that we had this year. But that is just the nature of agriculture, and the sales season is all based on fruit, so it's seasonal. Apples and pears are typically picked, in the fall months when you would go with your family or friends to an orchard. And then the storage period happens shortly thereafter.
And in terms of the monetization, are you selling the sensor, or is it more, you're deploying the sensor and charging some sort of subscription fee for access to the sensor data?
The latter. So we're deploying the sensor, and it comes as part of our service. So at the end of the day, the packer gets access to a dashboard that displays all the rooms that are being monitored by Strela, and they're sequenced in order of maturity. So which room needs to be opened first and sent down the supply chain.
And is there any kind of early indication of how much food waste you've prevented over the last year or two?
So we save typically, between $38,000 to $330,000 per room per year, which is a very large number, but I think it points to the volatility of the fields that we're working in. Apples can just have a bad pick one year for whatever reason and have extreme losses. To date, we've monitored about 500 million pieces of fruit with honestly just a couple hundred sensors, given the enormous volume that we deal with.
And then in terms of let's say, sifting through that amount of data, does that include a lot of kind of in-house proprietary software and data science and data mining to kind of make sense of it? Or, is it a relatively kind of clean data set that you can just kind of pass on to the customer?
Definitely not. The other thing is that it really depends on a lot of business decisions that the customer is making. So, for example, you could have a room that's starting to spoil, but nobody wants to buy Gala apples right now. And so that information has to be translated to us, and we have to think with the customer about what we can do in this situation to minimize loss.
And what are some options? Like, could you sell to a different client? Maybe those are going to supermarkets, but now they can go to, I don't know, school lunches or hospitals or caterers. Like, are there other solutions that a given, apple producer can take advantage of if they are about to lose, millions of pounds of apples?
Yeah, so one thing we can inform them on is how much of that room is being spoiled. So if it's a small percentage, maybe it makes sense to just cut the loss and, just call it a day, sell it when you can. Sometimes certain varieties fetch a higher price later in the season. So some packers might even take a slightly higher loss, let the fruit sit for an extra month, but then recover the margin at a later period of time. So we try to understand the business decisions of the packer and then tie it into our data and then do our best to make the correct decision. But it's every single year there's something new.
It's really interesting that you've kind of found this solution that really directly affects the bottom line of the client, but has this whole kind of sustainability kind of angle, basically built into the product and the concept itself. When you're kind of talking to these companies, are you talking to the sustainability department? Are you talking to like the actual executives who kind of control the entire company, because that's the core use case that they're thinking about, and that's the bottom line they're thinking about, or some other group?
Yeah, we generally talk to either the owners of the companies or the people who are running the operations on a day-to-day basis. So there's oftentimes one person who's in charge of picking rooms to open, and they really, really have a lot of pain. And so usually when we can get to them and explain to them that we are another tool to help you with this very difficult decision, we usually get some pretty positive responses.
And you mentioned earlier that the COVID definitely affected in-person sales cycles and sales calls and so on. How else has Strela been affected by COVID, positively or negatively?
I think for Strela, we've kind of realized how volatile a lot of this infrastructure that we rely on a day-to-day basis is. So at least I take for granted the fact that I can just walk into a grocery store and always see everything at least relatively well stocked. But I think COVID kind of highlights how a lot of these systems are becoming archaic and need to be translated into something a little bit more modern, especially as we live in a flourishing and growing society that has, increasingly more challenges ahead of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot about how, we have my family, never thought about supply chains 9 months ago, 10 months ago, and everybody's having those conversations in ways that just never happened before. You mentioned earlier, like the kind of magic that an apple appears in a supermarket and how does it actually get there and all the different steps. I've been very opaque and behind the scenes. And, I think surfacing that like there are farmers, there are packers, there are all these different roles and people involved just to get an apple from one place in the world to another place and into somebody's hand for their lunch has an incredible amount of complexity. And yeah, to your point, if any of that breaks, you have a lot of problems.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree.
So I also think that you raised a round of capital in 2020. And I was looking at the kind of public announcement, and there's some interesting investors. Could you tell us a little bit about that process?
Sure. And actually, that COVID actually affected that process as well. But we just got out just in time, as, things were falling apart. But the process,
Sure.
we basically, I still don't really understand how I fundraised, but I think it's just a lot of emailing people, looking for connections and warm introductions, and then giving it your best shot and seeing who you land on, really.
And in those demos, were there particular areas that got investors particularly excited about this concept and this idea?
Yeah, I think the fact that it ties so obviously to the bottom line is clear. I think the fact that we're starting upstream, but there's a lot of applications downstream and with other people within the supply chain is very compelling. And I think food waste is an immense problem, but it's also a huge market. And so explaining that type of a concept, I think, is very compelling to a lot of investors.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think that same kind of conversation around supply chains was foreign to a lot of investors included, 9 months or a year ago. I think a lot of them are now looking that there are all of these, opaque industries. And an opaque industry that has a lot of waste is, an investor's or VC's dream, really, right? Because you can build some pretty interesting companies in there, especially as these companies start to, digitize in other ways as well.
Yeah, and I think agriculture is an industry that VC hasn't really traditionally touched, but I think it's becoming ever more clear that it's a huge industry with a great need for new innovations. And it is something that is going to stay with us for a long time because everyone needs to eat.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons from some of the investors as part of this interview process that I've spoken to that they've kind of avoided is you have a lot of large monopoly players in the agricultural industry. You mentioned there's 40 companies really for you to sell to in the United States. I suppose what are your kind of views on that level of monopoly, and is there anything that could be done to kind of reduce that, or is that kind of as good as we can expect today?
It's hard to say because, there are pros and cons to having large organizations that kind of spearhead a certain industry. On our side, one of the pros that we see is that it's a lot easier to optimize a system when there's such a large volume. So, for example, if we're working with a really small packer that might only have 2 storage rooms, we can't really modify the order that they're opening these in because they have to make these 2 storage rooms last the whole year. So, if they're losing, 50% of their crop, this month, they can't really do anything about it. Whereas when you're working with a larger player who has a lot of volume and a lot of ways to move the product, we can come up with more creative and quicker solutions to mitigating the food waste. So sometimes there are pros to monopolies, if you will, but obviously I think there's a big trend also towards, smaller companies that are focused on very specialty products in agriculture. And that's also very exciting as well.
And where are you today? So in terms of size of team, kind of, and also what are your next steps over the next or your goals for the next 2 years?
So we're about 7 folks right now. Our focus right now is on servicing our packing customers, making sure that everyone's happy and that we're providing useful data to them. And we're also looking at expanding into other segments of the supply chain, such as retail. So retailers kind of have a similar problem to packers where they receive a lot of inventory and they usually sequence it just based on first in, first out. So whatever truck came in first to the dock is the first fruit that comes out of the system. But there's not that much information about what the shelf life of the product is, where it came from, how long it's going to stay on the shelf, how quickly the pressures or starches or sugars are going to drop off for it. So we're providing information that allows a retailer to sequence their order from first in, first out to first expiry, first out.
And can you use your existing sensor and infrastructure for that other use case, or would you have to adapt it in some way?
So the general hardware remains the same. There's a little bit of nuance when it comes to the data itself. So for example, if we're monitoring on a single pallet level, a single truck has about 10 pallets of fruit. So we're going to be receiving signals from other pallets as well. And we just need to work on filtering out signals that we're not interested in versus ones that are giving us the information that we need. So that's what we're iterating on right now.
You mentioned apples and pears, I believe. Do you have to have basically a different sensor or a different model for every other additional type of fruit, or how does that work?
So fruits are generally categorized into climacteric and non-climacteric. So climacteric fruits are the ones that emit these gases that we measure. So for most climacteric fruits, the sensor technology is the same. It's just the sensitivity. So we just modify how sensitive our sensor is to ethylene gas. Then there's non-climacteric fruits, some of which are sensitive to these gases. So for example, if you put a tomato, which is emitting ethylene gas, next to a head of lettuce, which doesn't emit it but is ethylene sensitive, you've actually just killed the shelf life of your lettuce too. So it's important to understand the environment that lettuce or leafy greens have been exposed to in order to understand whether or not they can actually survive that sticker date that has been put on the bag.
And you're definitely tackling the supply side of the food waste problem, but there's also the demand side where you have perfectly healthy fruit and vegetables that may not look that great, but are actually completely fine for human consumption, and they're still getting thrown into bins because as consumers we've kind of been educated, for quote unquote educated, for want of a better word, in terms of what exactly a carrot should look like or a head of lettuce or whatever it may be. What are your thoughts on the kind of the opportunities to mitigate the waste on the demand side of food?
I think it's so cool. I'm really enthused by all the companies that are working in that space. I don't think anybody likes that fact that consumers only pick that perfect piece of fruit. Every time I talk to a farmer or grower, anyone who's been anywhere close to growing a piece of fruit, they're very saddened by it too, because you spend all this time and energy and all these resources, growing this plant, and then so much of it just goes to waste for essentially no reason.
When we were growing up, I grew up on a farm, which I mentioned before, but my brother and I, we always loved the carrots because if a carrot hits a small pebble or stone, it splits, and sometimes you get some pretty interesting looking carrots. And so it was actually a hobby to try and find some weird carrots to eat at the farm table.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. They're also, they're more visually interesting. If your dinner can have some sort of interesting look to it, why not take it?
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that you started a company, as a university student and kind of went from there. Is there anything that like universities can do more to kind of encourage entrepreneurship, early founders? And I suppose what are your views on the advantages and disadvantages of starting a company as a student?
Yeah, so I think universities generally do a pretty good job. I think one thing that they could do better is kind of highlighting the fact that this isn't that serious. When people start talking about, building a company, a startup, I think the initial stages are really just an experiment. It's trial and error, and highlighting that and allowing people to, go to a pitch competition and maybe not give the best pitch, but, learn something, walk away with some new piece of information and just make it a little bit more open to everybody could be something that universities could do. I understand the thinking from both sides of the table about starting a startup in university. It makes a ton of sense to me to go into an industry, get some experience there, and then start creating a solution from within, or even just having worked in any sort of industry, starting to build a company. At the same time, I obviously started a startup in university, and I found that to be great because it's University is essentially a place where you are allowed to make mistakes and there is really no repercussion to it. So I could work on my startup after classes and not really be worried about, my next paycheck or whether or not I'm making the right career decision because all I'm being right now is a student.
So how much of the, I absolutely agree with all that, but I suppose one of the things that I always, when I think about my own life, when I was in university and I was similar to you, I was going academic track for philosophy and then, completely changed it and worked in tech then for 15 years. But it didn't ever really, as was occur to me in one way about, and then this is a while ago, so things have changed now in terms of how fun and exciting startups are. But it never really occurred to me that that was even an option. And then secondarily, like when I think, and I talk to a lot of students today, and I'm always, encouraging more risk taking and so on. There seems to be sometimes like psychological or emotional reasons that you are in this kind of safe place really to kind of experiment. You still have food on the table, all those kind of things, but people still have these kind of emotional barriers to it. Is that something that you found when you kind of talk to your peers at that level, or am I on the wrong path?
No, I definitely understand that. And I certainly felt that way myself too. It's kind of hard to think about. I didn't even really think about it as a startup. It was just an interest I had. And then that led to a project. And then that eventually led to, oh, there's some sort of, use case here. When I say these things on a podcast, like several years later, it looks so packaged and planned out. But the reality is it was just, me pursuing a certain interest. And I definitely understand that. Well, I think one of the things that I did in university that helped me kind of stay on track was I used to sign up for like any pitch competition or any like business plan competition I could, because personally I couldn't hold myself accountable for this thing that I was building. But when I had an external deadline, kind of like a homework assignment, I would get it done just because I had to.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. When I've been involved in startups in the past, like everybody loves the announcement that you've started something. Like everyone's like, "Oh, congratulations, you've started something." But 3 months in, like unless you have people holding you accountable, and when you have investors, obviously they definitely hold you accountable. But before you have that, I find having some sort of group, they can be friends, they can be family, they can be people in the industry, but send that monthly email, even if you basically have done nothing. You have to, you're holding yourself accountable to that monthly update email and all the stresses accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I did was I wrote in a Word document what I thought would be a reasonable goal to have before graduation for a startup, because, I was making the decision of not going to grad school. So I didn't want to end up somewhere, at the end of my 4 years of college where I hadn't really worked on a startup, but I also hadn't really applied to grad school. And so I was stuck in no man's land. So I wrote down what I thought my goals for the startup should be by the time I graduated, closed it, didn't think about it for a year and a half, and then returned to it when I got close to graduation.
And what are your thoughts on managing people? You mentioned you have a team of 7 now, and those people now look to you as the founder. What have you learned about managing and people in various ways?
Oh, that's a very broad question. Certainly still learning. I think every single person has their own drives or needs. And so the best thing to do in management is to learn what it is that the person needs and how you can best align their interest to your interest and help them out with whatever goals that they may have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I always find managing people, like it's real work, right? It's like a lot of managers don't get enough training, I would say, especially the companies I've been involved in. And, sometimes it only takes a couple of, 1 day training sessions or just observing other managers or thinking about the great managers people have had in the past at other jobs to kind of really think that, nearly as much work needs to sometimes be put into management as all the other aspects of being a founder.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite frankly, I think I haven't gotten enough management classes, if you will. A lot of it has just been learning on the job and seeing what works and what doesn't in the most brutal ways sometimes. And that's kind of how I've had to learn it. If you have any resources, that would be great. I would really appreciate them.
Yeah, no, there's a HBR, Harvard Business Review, they've got a series around identifying what the type of manager you are, because that's also part of the psychology, right? Like, are you the kind of manager who, like you're actually the best person to do the task and people look to you to kind of show them how to do it and you follow them, or are you more an enabler of the skills of others? And are you more closer to a dictator, I guess, or kind of authoritarian? And they have kind of these 5 criteria. And, what's interesting about their approach is that depending on the situation, like any one of those may be needed. Like there are, cases when, and I've talked to a few people in the past about this, but the idea of like a peacetime versus wartime CEO, right? Sometimes you just basically need to kind of restructure things. And so, if you were an in-person events planning company CEO in, March 18th of 2019, or sorry, 2020, and COVID basically wipes out your business, you have to move into a different footing compared to previous to that when things might have been going relatively easily. So yes, I definitely can send that over and add that as a link in the show notes as well.
That's a very good point. Even on a daily basis, you have to decide which hat you're going to wear. And oftentimes, if you choose the wrong one, it doesn't really work. We've had sometimes, I think the way that I've done it in the past was, we're all a team and I want every single person's input on every single thing. At some point, it became a little too overwhelming to get every single person's input on everything. And we needed to become a little more specialized on what each individual was doing. So that was one of the shifts that we had to take as a company as we grew from, a very small team to still a small team, but a team that's a little more specialized.
Yeah, those shifts are really fascinating to me because like in those first 4 to 5 people, you can get everybody on an email chain or a Zoom call or whatever in a room pretty quickly and easily. Like I think that kind of about where you are up to about 20 people, like that's when a lot of things start to break because people are like, oh, I don't know what the other person's doing. I used to always know, and people are shifting into that specialization that you mentioned, and a lot of companies struggle through that period. And I've been at companies that definitely struggled in that period, and it's one of the things I think a lot about it. That period is like so crucial to a startup's life. It's basically from year 2 to year 4. How do you kind of traverse that? And I don't think anyone has the answers, but it sounds like you're definitely approaching it in a kind of very conscientious way.
We'll see. I'm right in that year 2 to year 4, and everything you're saying right now is something that I think about on the daily basis.
Kind of broadening it out, there's a lot of founders who are starting to look at the space. You've come into it. What are some of the other opportunities that you think are in, either food or sustainability that are kind of exciting areas for other founders to potentially explore?
I certainly think any solution as relates to food waste is critical. We don't think of ourselves as a silver bullet to solving this enormous problem. There's a million ways to address it. So one of the ways that you brought up was, re-educating the consumer about what produce should look like and making it okay to buy that imperfect piece. There's a lot of other supply chain solutions from, forecasting demand in a retail store to understanding consumer behavior to even marketing efforts that, make consumers more likely to buy something fresh and sustainable that I think are all, super valid and really exciting.
Yeah, I think the amount of opportunities in sustainability writ large, right, that have real dollars behind them and are very big and real businesses that people can build while maintaining like this kind of mission forward approach. Like you're, from the sounds of it, mission driven from the very beginning. It's like, how do we stop this incredible injustice? There are people starving in the world. Yeah, we have this amount of food waste. I think that combination like is definitely starting to attract more and more people who want to found companies.
Yeah, I absolutely love the fact that I can work on a startup, but then also do something that I feel like is hopefully at least trying to be helpful to the environment and to our communities.
I mean, worst case scenario, you're saving, millions of tons of fruit, right? Like that, I think a lot of startups, like they're so difficult. And I often think about worst case scenarios. And I've talked to companies where, they're in very heavily competitive spaces, but they're mission driven. And particularly on the kind of carbon sequestration side of things, these are a lot of the people that I talk to on a day-to-day basis. And, I was at a forum once and somebody was asked like, oh, if your approach doesn't work, like, what are you going to do? And they were like, well, I've just, I've enriched the lives of, millions of poor farmers. Like that's still a good thing, even if that is not the answer to climate change or whatever else. And so, I think having those kind of principles and that mission from the beginning, makes those very difficult days as being a founder a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say is, when things are really not going well on some days, it's that final push that gets you over the hump, I would say.
Yeah, that's absolutely. So, Katya, this has been a great conversation. Is there anything I should have asked you about but didn't?
Oh, I did have one piece, which was a little bit more on the consumer side of things. So,
Sure.
a lot of people ask me, why do you focus upstream? There's so much food waste occurring downstream. And I think that's a really great question and just something that I wanted to address. First of all, any consumer solution to food waste is awesome and I fully champion it. But the way that we look at, solving a lot of these supply chain issues is that if we can work on solving them upstream, then we can eliminate a lot of consumer issues downstream. So as a super anecdotal example, when I go to the grocery store, I buy 5 avocados and I end up eating maybe 2 or 3 of them. And that's just because they're so volatile. One goes bad in a single day, another one doesn't ripen for 2 weeks, and as a result, I end up just throwing away half of my avocados. We think that in a supply chain where you can go to the store and always get a consistent product, you can eliminate food waste on the home front as well.
That's really interesting. I often, like, kind of spinning off that, I often think that sometimes, the modern kitchen is not very well designed for food preservation. Like our fridges, for example, are a lot bigger than our freezers. And, if something's frozen and we take it out, presumably we're basically eating it straight away. Whereas something in a fridge, you could have those 5 avocados and like they vary so much. And so, I think there's points all the way through that also compound the issues you mentioned there that just make it very easy to kind of produce and create waste.
Yeah, and that's honestly another solution that we'd like to eventually tackle with our sensing technology is, for example, if we could put a sensor in a fridge and that way we could tell you that your avocados are going to go bad in a couple days, that would be an excellent application of a technology that predicts ripening on the consumer level.
You just 10x your total addressable market with that line. So yeah, I love it. I think that's great.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see all the different applications for what we're doing and just letting the market lead us, really.
Fantastic. That's always, I think, the best approach. Well, Katya, thank you very much.
Thank you.